Hey everyone, it's Samuel.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling, and where we believe that everyone can be a storyteller. Today in the Prime Material, organized crime in TTRPGs. In the wilds, pixies. And in the tavern, what would you do if you got indebted to the wrong people? Well, it's absolutely great to have you back, Matt. How are you doing?
Doing good. It has been a hot minute since I've been on the podcast, but it's great to be back.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you're off doing much more important and amazing things like teaching children right now is a big part of your life.
Yeah, I got a job as a teacher, and I'm loving it, but it is also very... it's just a lot. It takes a lot out of you, and everyone tells you the first year is the hardest, so it's taking most of my energy right now.
Well, we certainly appreciate you hopping on to discuss organized crime with us. We had to have you on, and I won't say why, but maybe it's because you were organized. No, I'm just kidding. Before we get into it, though, let's run through some quick announcements. Remember to follow us on all our social media. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Plot Hooks. You can also check out our YouTube channel. You can search Plot Hooks and you'll pick us up there as well. And normally we just have episodes of the podcast up there, but there's a really cool video which is up there now relating to Disaster Hamsters 2. As of the airing of this episode, we have announced publicly that we are launching a Kickstarter for Disaster Hamsters 2. There is a massive team of 17 people behind this project, which is so exciting. We really want to make this happen, but we do have to raise about $22,250 to make it happen and make sure that we are able to pay everybody equitably in order to make this massive TTRPG book happen, which has everything from lots of mechanics to be able to play as hamsters and small mammals in TTRPGs, to an incredible campaign setting that's just full of sentient animals, to an adventure which takes you from levels 1 to 3, where you get to play as hamsters waddling through this nature preserve. So we really are excited about this. The Kickstarter launches January 4th. So we are just now announcing everything. You could go to Kickstarter and follow the page and get prepared for it launching. You could check out all the information, check out the video. Just check it out. It is amazing. I can't do it justice here, but we can't thank our team enough for being part of it, and we can't thank you enough for supporting us and getting us to this point where we're able to launch a Kickstarter. And speaking of supporting us, we have a new patron to shout out. Nick, thanks so much for joining the Patreon at the very rare tier. That is awesome, and thank you very much for your support. And if you'd like to check out our Patreon and all the content that we have going on up there, we'd appreciate your support. Especially right now, as we just had to purchase a new computer. A big unexpected expense, but we're happy that we were able to do it, especially because of some of the support that you've given us over on Patreon. So check it out, patreon.com/plothooks. Tons of content there, and you get to support this creative network. But with all of those long-winded announcements out of the way, let's get into the main topic: organized crime. So contrary to what I've joked about, you have not been involved in organized crime, Matt, but one of the main TTRPGs that you have played is Star Wars campaigns, right? And a big part of kind of that genre of storytelling, especially in the Star Wars setting, is kind of interstellar criminal organizations like the Pikes or what have you. You've got all the smuggling stuff. A lot of the main characters, even in proper Star Wars canon, in terms of the 9 movies, are smugglers or deal with the seedy underbelly and stuff. And so there's lots of organized crime which naturally pops up in Star Wars. So you've used that quite a lot in your storytelling.
Right, and specifically because specifically the system I run with Star Wars is the Fantasy Flight Games Star Wars system, which is one system broken across 3 books. And 2 of the books, each book focuses on a different aspect of the Star Wars universe. So one focuses on the Force and Jedi, one focuses more on galactic warfare and the Empire and the Rebellion. But the first book that was released was Star Wars Edge of the Empire, which is almost completely focused around, I guess, what Obi-Wan Kenobi would call scum and villainy, and smugglers and explorers and gunslingers and gamblers, and like just a whole kind of crime, seedy underbelly, life on the edge of the galaxy idea. So
sure.
the main book, and I ran that, and I still run games with it, but my sort of formative experience running games, as a DM, was in the Star Wars universe and was using Edge of the Empire system. So a lot of emphasis on crime as a plot point, and of course that naturally leads into organized crime.
Sure. Absolutely. And of course, one of the more famous characters of the original trilogy, in kind of a background character, a threatening character, until we get to his appearance and eventual death, spoilers for a 40-year-old movie, in episode 6, is of course Jabba the Hutt. And that was expanded upon with the whole Hutt crime family in, the extended lore, with things like the Clone Wars series and all sorts of stuff. It's such a big part of that genre. So if we were going to be able to have you on during a Thanksgiving break, then absolutely organized crime was the time to do it. This month's theme, as voted on by the patrons, is treachery. So it's awesome to have you on to chat about this. When we talk about organized crime in TTRPGs, one of the things that I did in preparation for this podcast was just look at things like the FBI and Education for Justice and organizations to look at real world organized crime, because it really is a pretty broad term. It basically just means an organized group of individuals that operate either wholly or in part in some sort of illegal fashion in order to accomplish certain goals. And those goals could be basically anything that you want. The classic is, power and economic gain, but it could be all sorts of other things like influence. It could be to inflict terror. I mean, technically speaking, a terrorist group would be considered organized crime because it's an organized group of individuals that are operating illegally to accomplish certain goals. And this is paraphrasing from the FBI. So, I suppose you could even get cases where a group is fighting for good, but is labeled as criminals by some sort of evil totalitarian system that is the group in charge. And in that way, that particular group would be considered organized crime. So, it's a pretty broad, generic term. But what we're going to be talking about today is narrowing in on what I think most of us think of when we say organized crime, which is an ordered and coordinated group of individuals that participate in underhanded activities in order to gain power and money. You think of, things like crime bosses, where you're talking about the mafia, you're talking about, in other media, people like Jabba the Hutt, people like the Maronis and the Falcones in Batman mythology. You think of real life organizations like the Irish Mafia or the Italian Mafia, and these groups which are organized as some sort of way in order to gain power and money. There's lots of different ways that you could do this, but no matter what flavor you take on it, there's kind of like 5 different ways which seem to kind of be more or less universal across most organized crime syndicates in this vein. And that is that there is a obvious hierarchy to them, that they are, secondly, often based on some sort of common connection, thirdly, that they're very insular, and fourthly, that they have some way to generate profit, and fifthly, that they have some way of putting pressure on individuals. And so these are things for us as we're telling stories in TTRPGs with organized crime. These are things to look at and make sure that we include in order to really give that feel of an organized crime group that is being interacted with by our party, or fought against by our party, or that is recruiting our party. Having these things will really help create that authentic organized crime feel. And of course, there's lots of other ways that you could do it. These are just the 4 things that I picked up through the 5 things that I picked up through just the looking at stuff with the FBI and Education for Justice. So the first thing is just hierarchies. And I think with Star Wars, that's, just we're going to keep returning to that just because of the, nature of most of your experience with using this type of storytelling. I mean, that is a pretty clear cut. I mean, you even look at, something like Jabba the Hutt, you just look at how he acts in episode 6, and there's obviously a clear hierarchy there. You could see him, you could see his second in command, Bib Fortuna, and then you could see, you could see that there is an ordered way that the organization works with one person at the top of it, or in some cases a group at the top of it. That hierarchy is often very blatant in media like Star Wars.
Yeah, and it's also, and this is kind of where, because again, the whole point of this podcast is to, how do we tell stories using these tools and tropes. And something I think that the original Star Wars trilogy does really well is using hierarchy to build mystery and tension, and also to motivate characters. So throughout the original first 2 films, New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, you have this sort of constant threat of Jabba, over the head of Han Solo, and it motivates pretty much almost all of his decisions, at least all of his bad decisions, that kind of lure him, because it's what gets him to try to take the job with Obi-Wan to pay off his debts, and it's what gets him where he wants to leave the Alliance at the start of Empire, if I remember correctly, because he has to go pay off, he's trying to go pay off Jabba again, and that creates some tension between him and Leia, and ultimately it leads to his capture at the end of Empire, which of course kind of catapults the opening of Return of the Jedi. So and it's really interesting because something that the Edge of the Empire game does mechanically is they kind of try to mimic this plot point mechanically by having what they call obligation as a mechanic. And as you go through the game, your obligation can go up and down. And when it hits certain numbers, when a number gets to a certain size, it starts creating problems, and it's really just sort of a tool for GMs to use to create stories, but it's trying to mimic that mechanic. And so using hierarchy, what it does, and this is, I promise I won't harp on the edits to Star Wars, but a flaw in one of the special editions for A New Hope is that they actually show you Jabba the Hutt in one of the edits in A New Hope. And that's really a mistake, because one of the great things about those original films is this name, Jabba the Hutt. Well, what the heck is a Hutt, right? What's a Jabba? And you don't know that until you see him, and all of a sudden he's this giant slug monster, and it's a great sort of his name has presence before he shows up. And I think in terms of storytelling, that's probably one of the best uses of hierarchy, is you can have a name, right? A person at the top of this organization, or people, right? It could be an individual, or it could be a group of people, depending on how you want to structure it. And you can use that name behind smaller characters, people like, again, in Star Wars, Boba Fett, and other bounty hunters who are working for them. You can have that name be over and above and behind those characters, so that you can generate suspense and tension and up the ante of the story without actually introducing a main villain yet.
Yeah, and I feel like Star Wars in general did a really good job of that, in not just organized crime, but just throughout the entire original trilogy. I mean, one of the main themes of the original trilogy is, kind of the little guy rising up and what you can do if you fight for what you believe in. And you have also just within the Empire, you have the figure of the Emperor that is, I think, just mentioned in episode 4. You see him barely in a hologram in episode 5, and then eventually he's finally there in episode 6. And but throughout, it's this force. It's that this main villain in Darth Vader is not even the top dog. He's the second in command. And you see even in like the boardroom scenes in like A New Hope, where you see the first Force choke, and you're talking about that is a battle of hierarchy. There's two different segments of that organization. There's Darth Vader as this Force user, and you have the political militaristic side of the people under Grand Moff Tarkin, with Grand Moff Tarkin at the top. And you see kind of that battle for position, but there's still always this person, this boogeyman that's out there that is still on top of them. But the organizational structure is clear that, well, you're never going to be able to give your players an organizational chart, and you're never really going to be able to make it extremely obvious exactly how it works. But you don't need to. It's just a matter of including that clear hierarchy, that there are people on top of other people. There are people that do jobs for the people below them, and it works all the way up until you have people at the very top that are running the whole organization. And I think you're exactly right. Looking at Star Wars and the way they did that in the movies is a great way of getting inspiration for doing that in your stories.
There's also a very practical reason for a DM to use this kind of trope of hierarchy in organized crime, and because one of the constant struggles when you're dealing with, at least in the games I've run, when you're dealing with an RPG and trying to tell stories, is you can never control what your players are going to do or what they're going to attempt. And if they succeed, it's really dangerous to take away a victory from them for the sake of a longer term story you want to do. That generally is a bad taste in their mouths. And it feels cheap. So something that hierarchy does really well is it gives you a very good excuse as a storyteller to have your big bad off screen. Where they cannot say hit them with a disruptor rifle or drop a grenade at their feet, right? Like, and ruin a plot. I'm not bitter about this at all. Anyway, point being that it's something that I experienced where I would introduce a character that I liked and wanted to get more out of, and then my players, either because I didn't prepare well, or they simply outsmarted me as a DM, or just rolled better and the dice determined that they would win that day, meant that they killed off a character that I had plans for. And as a DM, that can be frustrating. But if you have a hierarchy, you can come up with interesting and entertaining and fun minions to be sent after your players, but that you don't mind losing if they happen to die in the game. Or otherwise incapacitated, without risking, grinding your narrative to a halt because we just, we killed we kill Jabba the Hutt in A New Hope. What happens in the next two films, right? Like, we suddenly lost a crucial plot point. So it allows you to maintain control of the narrative as a DM without railroading your players, because you have a genuine reason for this particular character who has a huge amount of influence over the story to not be directly accessible.
Sure. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense.
And on top of that, it means that by the time you do introduce that character in the flesh, and you have a direct conflict with them if your story goes there, it's very satisfying for the players because they've been the thorn in their side for who knows how many sessions. And now they finally get a crack at them. So it's really, it's good for player motivation and them having a good time with being able to resolve a story, and it's good for DMs keeping some amount of narrative control without railroading your party.
Sure. No, that's awesome. So hierarchy is the first thing to think about when we're talking about organized crime storytelling in TTRPGs. The second is common connections. Oftentimes, with any group, not just organized crime, but with any group, a big reason why the group exists is a common connection around a certain factor. That could be a cultural factor, an ethnic factor, a religious factor, adherence to a single individual, like people that are following a particular leader or a particular person. There's some sort of common connection that unites the group. And when you start talking about a very, shall we say, intense group, like an organized crime syndicate, oftentimes that is ratcheted up even more. There is some sort of connection within the group which often really enhances the unity of the individuals, whether that be, like in Star Wars, where you have certain groups which are entirely made up, generally speaking, of one racial group, like the Pikes, which I mentioned earlier. You can have people that are allied around a certain belief of trying to overthrow a certain society, or trying to cause chaos for a particular reason. There's just some sort of common connection which often unites these groups, and it doesn't always have to be the case, but that is one thing to think about as you're developing your organized crime group that your party's going to interact with. Think about what that common connection would be, and how to throw it into a story, because that'll really give the characters some natural motivation, the NPCs that they'll be interacting with. Why are you doing these things? Well, it's not just because I want to make money. It's also because I have allegiance to this particular leader at a very intense level, like almost a cult-like level. Or I am united because these are my people. This is who raised me. This is, I'm united because this is a family thing. Find the common connection, and that will help with some natural storytelling, because the character motivations will be pretty intense.
Right, and when you're kind of developing these things, it's helpful to think about kind of the real world origins and causes of organized crime, because you've referenced the Italian mafia and the Irish mafia. In New York City, and I'm not an expert on this period at all, it's just sort of knowledge I've picked up. In New York City, at the turn of the century, when we had a bunch of immigrants coming in, you basically had a mafia for almost every cultural group that came over into New York. And the reasons for that wasn't that they were all particularly greedy or anything like that. It was because they were largely impoverished and oftentimes looked down upon and persecuted simply because they were, some particular ethnic group. And what the result of that was, people would band together to look after each other and seek their own interests, which generally led to crime. And now it's from a storytelling perspective, this gets really interesting because you can go various places with it. And I think a lot of the best sort of gangster mafia crime movies do this, where you can understand the origins of these groups in a very sympathetic sort of way, where there's even reports of like whole neighborhoods and stuff sort of being under the protection of mafia groups, which is we might talk about that a little bit later when we talk about the point of putting pressure on people, but in generating profit. But you can portray them sympathetically, but at the same time you can deal with the complexity of, yes, but these groups are often extremely brutal and do awful things to people, and it depends on the sort of story you're telling, and if it's a crime-driven story or if crime is an element in the background. Because if it's an element in the background, you can just sort of, you can have your players go deal with a Godfather-like figure because they need some information because they have to go fight, I don't know, some eldritch abomination or some demon king or something like that, and you can introduce crime as just sort of flavor to a world, right? But if you want to really delve into it, you can have issues like characters who are really sympathetic and are only part of a crime syndicate of some kind, out of almost necessity, because otherwise they're isolated and will be taken advantage of. Or you can have characters who are deeply unsympathetic and have taken all of the power of being in a crime family or a crime syndicate, and use that for their own gain and in order to brutalize people and be cruel and what have you, just because they have some evil tendencies to them. And you can have both those extremes and everything in between, all in one story, and all of the angles of where you take those characters and their motivations, it all comes extremely organically. And it almost writes itself. You just kind of have to have a few characters and their motivations, and it very quickly rolls out into a narrative that can be really engaging. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a way of humanizing is the wrong word, because you can have a common connection in a group that is very anti-human, so to speak. But it's a way of creating natural character development and making these NPCs, or even sometimes PCs if they come from a particular criminal organization, a way of really making them people. And it gives them conflict, like in terms of like how their personality meshes or does not mesh with the goals of the particular group, and there could be natural battle there, which the players can actually create as the players interact with this group and either move up in it, or try to take it down, or try to convince individuals in it of a reality that perhaps they're misconceived of, to try to get them to leave these organizations, and conflict will automatically happen because of those character elements that are there, because they're not just robots that are walking around with the command to be bad and do crimes. They're people that are in this group because of common connections and whatever other factors that the characters have. And, they're in there for a reason. So now they, have a very natural character conflict that can be developed if they're interacted with.
Yeah, and I feel like that kind of naturally leads into the next point, is about them being insular, and that they're mostly, they look inward and protect themselves in the way of life, because if you have a group based on these common connections, they are going to, it's sort of a, what's the line from, it's not the best Godfather movie apparently, but the third Godfather film, where it's like, just when I'm out, they pull me back in, kind of a thing, right?
Yeah.
Where they're, always, it's sort of once you're in, right? Once you're a jet, you're a jet, to quote the the musical. And it's, and there are pros and cons to that in terms of, you know, the people involved, because again, it's insular, it's going to look out for its own, but it also leads very easily to stories of betrayal too, where if you can have characters who step out of line from that insular nature and that more protective, self-focused kind of attitude, it can very easily lead to you know, those characters getting in trouble, right? And
absolutely,
it can also be good motivation for your antagonists, in the sense that where if your characters do something to threaten that order, even indirectly, right? It could be that, you know, this could be a way to introduce your organized crime element, because your characters might do something that's totally unrelated to this group, and not realize that they have, you know, impacted something that puts their way of life in danger, and suddenly they're marked because, you know, even without realizing it, they put themselves on the wrong side of this organization.
Yeah, and I think this is really key for, especially early on, whenever you're interacting with people in organized crime as you're telling your stories, because if it feels like that the mob is a business that you can walk into and just, you know, ring the bell at the counter and all of a sudden, you know, get a job with and interact with, and, you know, that's not quite exactly, you know, how it feels. And there's, you know, always those classic tropes of, you know, walking into mob bars and everybody that is in there knows what is going on, and like you walk in there and everybody's head turns. Like it's not that they kick you out immediately, but nobody talks to you, and it's just like they look at you and you could tell within a few seconds that for some reason you don't belong, and
right.
And you know, and that's an important feel to cultivate as you're starting out interacting with an organized crime group, because if it's too easy to get in, then, you know, why haven't the authorities gotten in and done something? Although, I mean, maybe you want to tell that type of story where, you know, the entire system is run by this particular group and they don't care anymore, and it's not insular at all because nobody can do anything to them. But, you know, having that sort of feel, I think, can really help drive home the point that this is an entity, a not just a few people that are, you know, working 9 to 5 and then go home and they're, you know, normal people. They are constantly 24/7. This entity is a thing. It's not just a group of people. It is an actual living being, in a way, that has its own, you know, various cells that go around and provide the different roles for the body of this entity. And it's it could really help generate that feel.
Yeah, and one more note on the insular nature, because I think you could break it down to all sorts of different types of organized crime, different fields of organized crime, but that point on feel and atmosphere is really important for your storytelling. And the way the group operates in terms of outsiders is going to greatly determine the sort of organized crime you're dealing with. So, for example, to use your example of a, you know, walk into a mob bar, that is very much a Italian mafia, Irish mafia, like you're probably dealing with something more like an ethnic group or a cultural unit that has gathered together around itself and is doing these sorts of operations, if that's the sort of feel that you're getting, because it is bound together by a culture that you are not involved in some capacity. Contra, to pull on my Star Wars experience, a major Star Wars crime syndicate is the Black Sun, and they are not bound by any sort of cultural element. They are almost more of a corporation or a business more than they am a mob family. And the result is a very different feeling, where it's less a large, it feels less like a large crime family, and more like a bunch of CEOs or warlords scheming against each other, for different profit. And they might you might very easily get involved in the Black Sun at a very low level, but you're not going to experience that more insular mob family type feeling unless you are much, much deeper into the system. And even then, it's going to have a more of a corporate, cold feeling about it. More cold-blooded than hot-blooded, maybe. So that's just something to think about in terms of when you're thinking through the sort of crime element you want to introduce, and what sort of atmosphere are you going for? Are you going for a local, closely connected entity, like you walk into a mob bar and everyone stops talking and looks at you because you don't belong? Or are you looking for sort of a larger, cold, almost mechanical, bureaucratic entity that might stretch across cities or star systems, that, like, it's like a Hydra. You don't know where the source of it is because it has so many heads, right? It's just two very different feelings.
Sure. Yeah, I think that really emphasizes, as you were saying, the connection between this point and the common connections point too. Sometimes that common connection might just be almost a business organizational structure. Like, the common connection is just economic gain. Like, the common connection in this particular organization is greed, or there's not necessarily a unifying factor that unifies them around a single individual or concept. It's just the group is together because they see a opportunity to prosper, and they see that by being together, united around the goal of profit or power, that they can be powerful and can achieve that goal. And in that case, the way that they are insular looks quite different than it does in other cases. So yeah, that's a great point. So we have hierarchy, we have common connections, we have their insular nature. The final two we can kind of hit together, and that's, having some way to generate profit and having some way to put pressure on individuals. And this is kind of the nature of the power and monetary nature of most organized crime. They're trying to make money or generate power, and they have to have some way to do that. And oftentimes, in order to do that, they have to have some way of putting pressure on individuals, because just walking to door and saying, hey, give me, $2, and then if somebody says no, walking away, you're not going to be a very profitable organization. You have to have some way of actually, getting that profit across the finish line. And if people do not come through, a la Han Solo with Jabba the Hutt, then you have to have some way of putting pressure on them so that your profit comes through, and so that other people see, even if you have to cut your losses with one individual, that other people see that you better not cross them, or else something will happen with you. And so these two things are connected, but we can think about, as we are telling stories, we could think of some creative ways of doing this. There's not just, of course, there's the tropey things. Of course, in real world, there's all sorts of kinds of, activity related to drugs or money laundering or all sorts of different profitable criminal activities. There's protection rackets. There's being, loan sharks, being some sort of economic way of using their collective funds in order to generate profit. There's all sorts of, tropey ones, but we could kind of get creative with it too, in how they can generate profit and how they can put pressure on individuals. It doesn't have to just be, give me your money in this back alley, or else, Bruno is coming over here with a baseball bat and is going to, hit your shins a couple of times. I mean, it doesn't have to just be brute violence in that sort of way. We could be some more creative with it.
Right, and again, that sort of depends on the scale of the organization and the scale and the tone that you're going for. Because what comes to mind, because again, I sort of made a distinction between sort of like a corporate bureaucratic feeling crime syndicate versus sort of a more your local family mafia kind of a thing, right? And the former, I did in one of my games, I had the party tracking down a guy who was running I believe it was a carbonite mining facility, and he was using slave labor to do it, and I'm trying to remember the exact details I did for this, but it basically played around with the idea that this was a type of organized crime. He had connections with different criminal groups, but he was also working with the Empire and sort of bribing officials and that sort of a thing to up his profits and make connections. And while in Star Wars, the Empire is sort of blatantly corrupt, so it's easy to do that sort of thing. You can do that in all sorts of settings where you can have them be generating a profit in something that looks legitimate on paper. So, for example, it's just like on paper, it's like, oh yeah, no, he runs a mining corporation out near the core systems, right? Nothing suspicious. And then you dig deeper, and it's got drug trades going on, and slave labor, and bribes, and all sorts of things, right? So you can have it kind of interact with the larger legal structure in some ways, in ways that are less, Bruno will break your shins, and more, oh, look, your bank account went to zero because I know a guy in IT who has just drained your finances. Now you better get, back working for me, or, you're never getting another dollar to your name, sort of a thing, right? Like different ways to put on pressure. And then on the more local scale, where it's more of a mafia family cultural unit vibe, what comes to mind to me is the fact that lots of times in these immigrant communities, they honestly preferred to have the mafia than the police, because the mafia in some ways treated them better than the police did at the time. And that can be an element for interesting storytelling, is that sometimes the pressure is actually a benefit to the people. Now, they might not like the fact that it's a protection racket, right? But, they might view it no different than having to pay their taxes. And at least they know the guy they're paying, right? Like, you can have a very different spin on organized crime and how they gain power. Because ultimately, they have to have a sort of profit. And they have to have a way to gain power over people. And power is not always, like you were saying, it's not always brute force. It's not even always threatening. Sometimes it's gaining the support of people. So you might have, like, here's a plot hook for you. You might have a whole community, and your players are brought in to deal with rampant crime, and they get there and they don't really see anything going wrong. And as they dig into it, they realize that the whole community has sort of decided that these guys who started out as a organized crime unit, and still are to the broader population, they kind of have their back, and they'll hide them in their houses and come up with cover stories for them, because they're actually benefiting in a positive way from it. And that could be a really that's a complicated story, but it could be a very interesting situation to put your players into.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of layers to that, and lots of interesting decisions that the players have to make. I love those kinds of stories where they go in to an assignment thinking one thing, and then they realize it's not that simple when they get there. That's always really intriguing. Especially because you have no idea where they're going with it, too.
And, of course, it depends on the sort of story you want to tell, right? Like, because I've had DMs who every session was this, giant moral quandary of what should we do and who's right and who's wrong. And, frankly, that can get kind of exhausting as a player. Sometimes you want Bruno just to be the guy who breaks people's shins, because then you can beat up Bruno and you feel like you've done a good deed for the day, right? But sometimes you do want to surprise your players, and it depends on your group, of course. If you just want a more black and white story where we get to deal with a mob now, all right, and you don't have to think much more about it. Or you can add a lot more humanity and complexity to it, and a lot more shades of gray if that's the sort of story you're looking to tell.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, as you're going through your organized crime stories, these are things to think about. They're not necessarily things that you absolutely 100% have to include, but they're just things to think about as you are telling your stories, so that we can create an authentic feel and really give the players some interesting knobs to turn as they're going through this particular plot of dealing with an organized crime group. You have the hierarchy, the common connections, the insular nature, having some way to generate profit, and having some way to put pressure on individuals. But yeah, lots of opportunities for treachery there, in terms of the theme of the month. But yeah, I think that's about all the time we have this week on the Prime Material. Let's head out to the wilds and look at a little bit of an unexpected creature for today. All right, we're out here in the wilds. Today's creature, as you were all expecting, pixies. Now, I like subverting expectations. And we hinted at this a little bit earlier, in especially when we were talking about hierarchy. You have this boogeyman of a name, this boss that's ruling this organization that is too high up for your players to even interact with. Just imagine, like, all of a sudden the players are working really hard, they're really scared, and all of a sudden they get to the highest level of an organization, and the highest level of the organization is just a bunch of pixies. I mean, what kind of subverting expectations can you... How good can you get? In Dungeons and Dragons especially, they're even cuter than they are. I think in popular lore, they running around with butterfly wings, it looks like, and they're these tiny little fairies which are good aligned in terms of a Dungeons and Dragons perspective, so you have to change that a little bit, but that's so fascinating to me, just to have a creature that you would totally not expect all of a sudden be involved in organized crime.
Yeah, and the fun thing about a pixie too, and then when you pitched this to me, I absolutely loved it, is that it can make for a fantastic reveal, but also can kind of organically make sense in a fantasy setting, because, I mean, a pixie is a trickster, and if you have one be, your mob boss, which is the one I like the most as an idea here, is that you get to the top of this crime ring, and it's, this little pixie actually running the show.
Petting their little tiny cat-like creature.
Well, I was thinking, and like it's what's the name of the movie? Zootopia, where they're following all of these they're following all this crime rings with the wolves or whatever, and they get to the they get to the Godfather's house and this giant chair turns around and it's like a mouse, like you can have that, but and then you can kind of have a roller coaster of subverted expectations, because you could be expecting some, like, I think there's I don't know the lore as well, but I think there's like a beholder crime lord, so you're expecting some, like, monster at the top of this chain, or at least a human, and then it's a pixie. And then you can turn around and show how, if you take the core idea of a pixie being a trickster and using illusions and manipulation, and actually make them terrifying. Because the first thing that came to my mind is that, like, taking a look at their just their attitude, like, they have detect thoughts as a spell. You could give them pretty much any spell from the spell book. I think you could justify, like, just imagine, like, here's an idea, for example, right? Like, your players keep running into people who have run across the mob, and they are, like, almost like brain dead. They're like, a lot of their personality is gone. They're just sort of wandering around. They're barely functional. And then when you get to the top, you realize that this fae creature is using her magic to punish those who come across her, to basically, like, strip them of their identity or something, right? Or maybe, drive people insane with illusions, and, you come at, like, you can do a lot with this with this idea, and turn this tiny little creature into an actual threat that is extremely scary, but it's not going to be a physically scary threat. It's going to be through manipulation and cunning, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But even when you're talking about physically scary, pixies have polymorph. Like, they can cast polymorph once a day. Like it's they have an ability that's not even a spell, that they could just use superior invisibility. I mean, you mentioned some of their other spells already. They're they are really weak, and doesn't take much to kill them if you hit them. They're still only a challenge rating 1/4 in terms of D&D specific lore. But I mean, it would actually make sense if they use the powers that they have in a nefarious manner. It would actually make sense that they could actually be something incredibly threatening. I mean, you could just have this mob boss that is this pixie that polymorphs into a bear to do whatever it wants. I mean, and that's just that's fascinating, because the more you think about it, of course, you're just like, at first you're just like, oh yeah, pixies, that's cute, yeah. And then you actually think about it, and you're like, well, with the way these are actually set up in Dungeons and Dragons specifically, these things can really mess you up if you handle them in the right way.
Right. Well, and again, sort of a nice lead in to maybe that, to a plot with this might be, like, one of the spells that I think in D&D is underestimated how powerful it can be is spells like sleep. Because one of its spells is that, well, you could have it, cast at a higher level. Like, just imagine, like, a string of robberies where, like, it's like, oh, well, did anyone see anything? No, everyone was passed out. Like, okay, there's some magic going on here, right? And then it's like, okay, well, did you see anything? No, like, stuff just started moving around, and, like, that could be fun. Maybe have them think it's a haunting, like a poltergeist, like, ravaging a town or something like that, and it turns out it's actually a bunch of pixies turning invisible, right? Like, there's just all sorts of stuff you can do that could, subvert expectations on several levels and play around with their abilities and personalities. And the personality's another thing, too, because, like, traditional lore is that they're neutral good, and they don't really like conflict and violence and all this sort of a thing. But if you take the mischievous nature of a pixie and then turn that into something more nefarious, you really could have something really scary and even sadistic as a mob boss, because they might sort of almost, I don't know why the Riddler is coming to mind, or like a Batman villain, right? Like the Joker, where it's like, oh yeah, like, oh, it's all mischief and fun, except it kills you at the end of it, right? Like...
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, imagine a Joker type character being a pixie.
Yeah, that's...
No, there's so much that you could do with this. It's hilarious, but also is really serious, and that's the reaction your players are going to have too. They're going to be like, oh, this is hilarious, and then they're going to see a pixie polymorph into a giant creature, and then they're going to get really serious really fast, and it makes for a incredibly memorable session, I think.
Yeah, it goes from, oh, okay, the DM was setting up one big joke, oh no, it's not a joke, very quickly.
Awesome. Well, I think that's about all the time we have out here in the wilds. As much as I love talking about pixies, let's head over to the tavern and close out the show with a little refreshment. All right, we're out here in the tavern, and a quick little plot hook to close out the show, though we've been interspersing plot hooks throughout this episode, so you're getting a little extra bang for your buck here in the this free podcast. What would you do if you got indebted to the wrong people? Now, I put this because this is just kind of a classic plot hook for getting people into an organized crime story. Like, they did something or somebody did them a favor that they did not realize was involved in organized crime, and all of a sudden, things are expected of them which are over their heads, and if they don't do them, bad things happen, but if they do them... But if they do them, they get in further under their head, and you're like, damned if you do, damned if you don't type of situation, and that can spiral pretty quickly.
Right, it's sort of the quicksand thing, where it's like the stronger you resist to try to get out of it, the more they drag you in, which is, kind of the whole point. But yeah, getting, like... It's the reason that the Fantasy Flight Edge of the Empire game uses obligation as its core mechanic. Mm-hmm. And there are various kinds of obligation, but the most common one is debt, because that is whether that's a favor that you owe, in that sort of obligation, or if it's a monetary debt, because that is just an extremely easy way to get the players involved in the story. And it's one of the things too where I think we can have a knee-jerk reaction to like, oh no, we need to make it more complicated. And it's like, well, yeah, you can. There are different types of debt, but there's a reason this is such a common trope, is that because it works really well, because the point is not to... The getting indebted part is not the interesting thing. It's what happens after that, which is why it's a hook, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Did you ever use this, by the way? Did you ever have a situation that you wanted to share where you used getting into debt?
Yeah, so debt came up pretty frequently in the games I ran. Most of my players' motivations were other sort of obligations or other things that they were sort of compelled to do. But they... Sort of the opening game we did was them trying to clear a debt, which is another kind of... That was our hook for the opening, is that these three characters were trying to clear a debt that they owed, and get out from under the head of... or under the control of a minor crime lord. And in the process, they ended up kind of creating more problems for themselves. They came back later. We also had more common than monetary debt was using favors. So they might call in a favor with a character and then have them, come back later to, ask for a favor in return. I used that one a few times. Most of my characters already started with connections to a crime syndicate of some kind, so I didn't really need to use them getting indebted to kickstart the story, but I did use past debts and obligations and connections to to the crime syndicates as plot hooks and story motivators. So you can, with the debt being the backstory that got everyone rolling in the game to begin with. But it's certainly something that you can use to kickstart a plot, and then once the plot is rolling, the debt might continue to be part of the motivation, but more often than not, in my experience, that initial debt becomes replaced with connections to characters or past favors or problems that have resulted because of the interactions with the mafia, and then the debt sort of fades into a background element that you can pull out when it's useful, and in general, more interesting and dynamic stories tend to take over from that initial seed.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, it's been fun talking about criminal activities.
Oh, sorry. And my lawyer just sent me a message. He insists that, legally speaking, I have never been involved in any organized crime. We just want to make that clear.
Oh, that's funny. Yes, me neither. But we're here to tell stories about it because it can be a really fun story element. So thank you very much for listening. Be sure to interact with us on social media and tell us what other stories you've told regarding organized crime in your particular play groups. We'd love to hear about it. Be sure to check out Disaster Hamsters as well. Be sure to check out the video. Be sure to check out and follow the Kickstarter for it. Check us out on Patreon. And yeah, thanks very much for joining us today, Matt. It was awesome to have you back on, and we look forward to doing it soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was fantastic to be back and talk about crime and Star Wars and RPGs, and hopefully I can do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all very much for listening again. From all of us here at Plot Hooks, thanks from Becca and from Izzy, and I'm Samuel, and we will see you all again next time for another episode of Plot Hooks.